People, good coffee. Welcome to this new video. Welcome to my channel and welcome back to my home. We're here because today I have for you a tutorial of sorts. A beginner's approach to raw processing with Raw Therapee. And for those of you that don't know, Raw Therapee is a fantastic piece of software. It's an open source, a free, a multi-platform raw processor available on Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and it has a depth of features that can be daunting. At first, it can be a little intimidating, but hang in there, buckle up, and hopefully I'm going to do a decent enough job in explaining how to approach this software as a beginner. I'm going to entirely skip and ignore whole sections of the software, mainly because Raw Therapee offers really multiple ways of achieving the same result. It's such a powerful software that there's a lot of ways of doing the same thing. There's a lot of methods for achieving the same results. So I'm going to choose, on the one side, those methods that I use, because this is also to show my specific workflow. It's not a silver bullet, it's not a recipe, it's mostly how I use the software. And secondly, I want to focus on the easy way of achieving a great result. Now, with that said, I want to just take a quick second to ask you to kindly consider supporting my work. If you find the content on this channel enjoyable or valuable, or if you've learned something here, please do consider supporting me by hitting that like button and sharing the video to social media. This is by far the biggest help you can do, and it's entirely free. It just costs you a couple seconds. And for me, it means the world. It pushes this video into other people's feeds. It tells the YouTube algorithm this is something worth suggesting, so please do smash that like button. If you're so inclined, there's also a buy me a coffee link down below. So there's an option you can make a small donation if you find it in your heart. Let's move over to the computer here and let's start editing. Right, this is the final processed image, and this is where we are starting from. Now, this is not a bad image per se, but there are a few obvious flaws right from the get-go. Firstly, it's slightly underexposed. The white balance is off, and if you can see, there's some sensor dust. Now, this image was taken with a Sony A7R Mark I, the first generation, still a beast of a camera, and the wonderful Konica Hexanon AR 40mm f1.8, for which I just recently released a review. So if you're interested, go watch that. But let's not waste any more time and let's start working. The first thing I always do, and I recommend you develop this habit as well if you're using Raw Therapee. But if you're not, this is almost always an automatic process. What I'm talking about is the demosaicing. Now, this is a really complicated matter, and I will just very briefly touch upon it because, firstly, I'm not nearly knowledgeable enough to be able to easily explain it. I understand it for myself so I can work, but I don't have the proper knowledge in order to be able to fully explain it. But in a few words, the image you see on your screen is not the image on the sensor. All sensors have a certain pattern. Most of them are what's called a Bayer pattern sensor. And this is what the image looks like on a sensor. Weird, I know. Let's zoom in a lot. And yes, this is the actual sensor pattern, the Bayer pattern. It's 2 green pixels for each blue and each red one. And this is why it's very green, because there are twice as many green pixels as there are blue or red. And if you really zoom in, this is 1600%, you can see the actual sensor pattern. It's just pixels. Now, what the mosaicing does is translate this raw data into an actual human readable image. And the software does that through a demosaicing algorithm. Now, Lightroom and Capture One and all those others will do this behind the scenes and completely automatically and unbeknownst to the user. But Raw Therapee, being the beast of a raw editor that it is, it lets you choose out of quite a few of the mosaicing algorithms. Now, I will just mention that my favorite is RCD plus bilinear. And to wrap things up with the mosaicing, all it has to do with is very fine detail. Let me just change to another demosaicing algorithm. And please pay attention to the jaggeds here. You see how it changes? Well, I've come to the conclusion that RCD and bilinear is the best and fastest demosaicing algorithm for my specific use case. I will then choose to autocorrect chromatic aberrations. Now, I'm not sure this is necessary for this particular image, but I'm also sure it's not doing any harm to the image. Then it's off to capture sharpening. Sharpening that happens just after demosaicing in the processing pipeline, and that is before all other adjustments. Now, I just enable this and leave it at the default settings. Now, moving on to the exposure tab. This is where most of our work happens. I usually start with the lab adjustments. Now, this is another very complicated matter. It's relating to color spaces. And safe to say, it's really a very forgiving workspace. And I found that I can really push the contrast. I usually stick to around values of 30. And it's really forgiving. It doesn't destroy the image. I will just push the lightness a little higher, and already you can see we have a much nicer image. A little bit of chromaticity, which is kind of synonym for saturation. Then I'm off to the beginning of the tab, and usually I try to see what auto levels does. Sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't. I will enable highlight reconstruction and choose color propagation as a method. It's what I found to be the best way to reconstruct and recover highlights. There probably isn't any need as of yet to do any highlight recovery, but I'm just keeping this on in case there is. I'm going to raise the exposure by, let's say, half a stop, maybe even a full stop. Yeah, I think it's starting to look nice, and we're already starting to see a bit of clipping in the highlights here, but we'll sort that out later. A little more contrast here, and you can already see this is quite more aggressive than the lab contrast is. A little more saturation. And silly me, I forgot the second most important thing. That's the white balance. Now, moving on to the color tab, you have the option to just pick. This is kind of great already. This here is perfect. This is a very natural looking image. And moving back to the exposure tab, a little more saturation. Let's open curves here. I'm going to reset this because it remembered my previous setting, and choose film-like. This is the profile, or let's say the algorithm the curves setting uses, and as the name suggests, it's kind of cinematic. It's almost film-like. I'm drawing a bit of an S curve here to get really punchy tones in this image, and I'm going to open up another tone curve here and adjust for the really dark shadows here. I'm just gonna create a point here and I'm gonna raise the shadows a little. Yeah, and this is starting to be real nice already. Shadows are still a little dark, so I'm going to use the shadow slider here and bump it up quite a bit. Do some preliminary highlight recovery. Let's just check our clipping, and we still have a bit of clipping, but we'll fix this a little later. Now the tone mapping module here is kind of harsh at its default settings, and that's why I usually just give it very, very little effect on the image, because I do like what it does, but I usually find that just a hair is enough to sharpen the image up a little bit. Now, dynamic range and vignette filter are setting, also graduated filters, are settings I rarely ever use, and I don't need them right now. Moving on to the detail tab, I usually just activate the sharpening module, click sharpen only edges and halo control, and leave it at that. Maybe let's just adjust this so that it doesn't affect the edges of really dark objects. Not that we have much of those, but it's good practice. Now onto the local contrast. This is another really powerful module, and the module that can easily ruin your photo if you just activate it at its default settings. Now it's not that terrible, but usually it's really kind of gross. It's really kind of harsh. So I take the radius down a little and take the amount down quite a bit. Let's take it on and off. And you can see it adds a little bit of a pop, a little bit more definition, let's say. Edges and micro contrast are some things that I never really use. Impulse noise reduction and defringe are modules I activate always and just leave them at their default settings. Quickly mentioning, the impulse noise reduction just gets rid of the digital noise, sometimes also known as the salt and pepper noise. It's, let me see if it's visible. It's the sort of noise that shows up as little black and white dots. Yeah, you can see here. Pay attention to this part here. It just corrects. I hope this translates well after YouTube's compression algorithms, but it should be noticeable enough. It just cleans up the image more. Noise reduction does, well, what it says on the tin. I'm blessed to have a really good sensor. The Sony A7R sensor, although being, what is it now, like 80 years old, it's really, really a fantastic sensor. No AA filters, so it's really sharp, really capable, awesome dynamic range. But there's bound to be some noise. What I'm getting to is that I usually don't need to do any sort of Luma noise reduction. I just enable this module and leave it at default with luminance at 0. And what this does, it just gets rid of the color noise. Hopefully you can see it. how it just, look here, you can see it best in the snow parts. You have these colored splotches, and just enabling noise reduction with luminance at 0, it gets rid of all that ugly color mess. Now, if you want to do some proper noise reduction, you can play with the luminance slider, but that's a bit of a subject in its own, because as with most things, noise reduction is a give and take process. You eliminate noise, but you also lose some detail, and then you have to use the detail recovery to recuperate some detail. But what I usually find satisfactory with my particular use case is just to enable noise reduction and leave it at its default settings. The fringe as well, it's a setting that, well, it removes the fringing, the color fringing. You can open the equalizer here and choose the specific hue of fringe aberrations you want to remove, but I usually find it enough to just turn it on. Moving on to the color tab, I'm just going to enable the vibrance here and give it a hair more vibrance. The soft light feature is almost like a contrast. What I think it does, it overlays a copy of the image over itself using a multiply blend mode. The result is very pleasant in the way that it's adding a little bit more punch to the image. I find it useful in some scenarios to change this output profile to RTV4 large. It's equivalent to the Apple Pro Photo working profile, which basically ensures that you don't have out of gamut colors. This is another subject in its own, and I will just leave it at that. What I would like a bit more is some added contrast. And to achieve that, we're going to pull this a little and also push this a little. Turn on our clipping indicator and compress the highlights a bit to ensure that we're not clipping. I need to raise the shadows a little more because the snow here is a bit dull, and we pretty much have a finished image. Now, before wrapping things up with Raw Therapee for this image, I would like a bit more punch to this image, a little more oomph, let's say. So in order to achieve that, I'm going to raise the contrast a bit more. I'm also going to go back to the color tab and do a bit of toning and push some warmth into the clouds. It might also be worth trying out the Haze filter, which is kind of gross at its default setting again. So I will pull it back to 0 and just raise it ever so slightly until I find that I enjoy how it looks. This is kind of nice. Now I'm going to send this image to GIMP in order to do just a little final touch-ups. I find that there are a few things that GIMP does better, or rather easier, than Raw Therapee. And those are the final contrast settings, spreading all the tones equally, well, not equally, but nicely across the entire histogram. As you can see here, we don't really have blacks here, just really a bit of a shadow, a lot of midtones here, and some highlights. What I usually do is make sure that I have blacks, whites, and everything in between. Now, in order to achieve that, I open up this levels adjustment, pull the black point all the way to the edge of the histogram, and ruin the image. But we're going to fix it by editing these settings as a curve now, raising the shadows, and as you can see, the image is much more contrasty, and we have blacks in the darkest parts here, we have whites here, and okay. I perhaps want a bit more detail in the clouds, and in order to achieve that, I'm going to pull the highlights down a bit. Right around here is okay. Do a bit of sharpening with this enhance filter and choose the unsharp mask. But be very careful with these sharpening filters. At their default values, they are usually kind of rough, really kind of harsh. So I just am careful to very slightly introduce a bit of detail, just enough that it adds to the image and almost that it's not noticeable. Then we have to get rid of this spot here, and for that I'm going to use the healing tool. Control click to choose a source here and paint over it. Let's just quickly move through the image and find if there are any more spots. I think there's one here, so let's clean that up. There's another one here. Let's clean that up. Luckily, the sensor is kind of clean, so there's not much work to be done here. Perhaps this one. And before exporting, what I pretty much always do is add a bit of noise. Now, why I do that is because I find that this digital sharpened look, you see those splotches? It's kind of unpleasant. And while nobody views your image at 550% zoom, I think it overall subtracts a little from quality, and adding a bit of noise, maybe 0.04 is a bit too much, but maybe 0.02 is okay. Yeah, adding a bit of noise in the post-processing tidies up images a lot. It makes them look more natural, more cohesive, and I dare say almost analogic. Now I'm going to speed this up. This is the next image I'm going to edit. It's a bit of a favorite of mine. These two guys chilling out, laying around, doing pretty much nothing. Wonderful atmosphere. I think it's really pleasant as far as composition goes. I'm going to do the same thing and just choose RCD bilinear as the demosaicing algorithm, autocorrection for chromatic aberrations, enable capture sharpening, and pretty much leave it at the default. Move over to the framing tab and use this tool to designate what we deem to be a straight line in order for the software to straighten the image. Help it a bit more by using this rotate slider. Go to the color tab and do some color correction. Now you can always try to use these two automatic settings. Temperature correlation is pretty much the same as in camera. RGB gray sometimes works, but not this time. Let's see what daylight sunny does. It's kind of green, but we'll just leave it at the default settings. Use the pipette. Pick from here. Pick a spot where it should be neutral gray. And we pretty much have a workable white balance. And you might find this odd, because I'm just now switching to black and white. Why would I want to adjust the color balance of an image if I'm turning it black and white anyway? And that is because the color temperature of the image affects the tonality of the black and white image. So I want a properly balanced image before I turn it to black and white, because that way I'm sure the tonal balance is right. Moving over to the exposure tab, I'm just going to activate the lab adjustments module, raise the contrast to 30, raise the lightness a little bit, jump up to the exposure tab, well, rather exposure part of the tab. Try auto levels and reset it because we don't like what it does. Activate our highlight reconstruction method. Raise the exposure by quarter of a stop, third of a stop. I say that's enough. Raise the contrast quite a bit actually. We're going to recover, or rather raise some of these darkened shadows by using a curve adjustment. Reset it and pick a point right near the darkest parts and raise the shadows. Now what that does is raise the values of pretty much all tones in the image. So in order to compensate for that, we have to make quite a bit of an S curve here in order to introduce some contrast. Activate the shadows highlights module and raise the shadows a little more. Activate the tone mapping module and lower this right down to 0.04, 0.03 maybe. There's no need for a vignette, there's no need for a graduated filter, but there is quite a bit of need for highlight recovery. We're just gonna use this highlight compression slider at first and see what it does. Let's also use the highlights here. And usually what I check when I do this much of highlight recovery is see if I'm losing the natural glare of a backlit shot. Now this is kind of a difficult shot. Contre-jour shots are usually a bit difficult to pull off correctly. And now we have a correct exposure as far as clipping goes, but it's not really all that pleasant. If I pull this down a lot, you can see you get back that glow, that natural look, considering this was shot in the evening, sun was setting right towards the sun, so it's quite natural to have a fair bit of glare. I'm also going to raise this a little just to give the image a little more shine, let's say. Pull this down a bit for a little more contrast. That's a bit too much. Let's move over to sharpening. Now local contrast. Pull this down. Pull the radius down a bit and the amount slider quite a bit. Impulse noise reduction and diffringe we automatically tick on. Move over to the soft light setting that adds a bit more punch. and check for clipped shadows. We have quite a bit of clipped highlights, but this is entirely expected. That's pretty much it. Now let's just send it over to GIMP and do some final touch-up to the image. Now that we're in GIMP, we're just going to do the same with the levels. And I think this is going to be okay. A bit too much, so we're gonna tone it down a little. The darks are a bit too dark. But this is okay. Really nice, contrasty, punchy image. Let's see if we can tone down the highlights a bit more while still keeping this shine. Yeah, I think it's okay. Okay. Yeah, it's a bit better now. It's a bit better now. Maybe. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Some sharpening again. Let's zoom in all the way to their faces and see what we're doing. And again, this is the wonderful Yashica 28mm f2.8, a really fantastic lens. Maybe it's still a bit too much. This is okay. Zoom out back to 1:1 and wrap things up with some noise. This being a black and white, a bit more noise is going to do just great. So with that said, well, this works. I'm just going to wrap things up here, and hopefully this has been helpful. This has been enjoyable. I want to thank you for being here. If you stuck through to the end, thank you. You're a legend. Until next time, be well, everybody. Bye-bye.